Welcome back, everyone. And right now, I want to start my sixth Constitution mini lecture, and I am giving this on the eve of my birthday. I'm taping this lecture on August 17th, and so in a few hours, I will be 62 years old. So since you're not there to wish me happy birthday, I'm wishing myself happy birthday. So. Uh, there you go. And probably someone's out there thinking, God, I thought that guy was a lot older given how he looks. But anyway, I'm in a great mood. Just had a great birthday celebration with my family. And now I'm excited to come back and talk to you. So when I left you with really a defining moment. The colonists and the British had coexisted for over a century and a half. They hadn't agreed on everything, but the relationship had worked well for a long time. The British, once again, saw the colonists as a captive market. They saw them as a source of raw materials. The British wanted to make money on the colonies. The British wanted to have the largest, most prosperous empire in the world. There was a certain prestige attached with empire. So power and profits and prestige were all there for the taking for the British. For the colonists, they were given protection, they were given a rule of law, and they were actually given a significant amount of freedom. And there were some restrictions on this, and later I will talk about them. For example, heavy censorship of the press. And then an event occurs that at first blush appears to be something very, very good for the British. The British are involved in a war from 1756 to 1763. The British are involved in a war called the Seven Years' War. I did not learn this war in school by this name, and perhaps some of you didn't either. When I was in school in the old days, this war at least was taught to us as the French and Indian Wars. And I know in junior high we studied this war quite a bit. The war is intriguing because the British win the war, although during this war in 1760, King George II dies, and his son King George III, or as he was often called in the colonies, Fat George, becomes King of England. And King George III was king for a long time. This man was king from 1760 until 1820. The British defeat the French, and at the end of the war, this war has really bankrupted the British. And so King George is taught as this bad guy, right, who wants to impose taxes. But let me just give this to you just for a moment from the British perspective. And from the British perspective, their thought is we're providing protection, which is very expensive. Now that we have defeated the French are no longer in the interior of the country. So, what we today call the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, this area is going to be open to exploration. The colonists can go up over the Appalachian Mountains and discover these new places. Once again, I try to give you the personal touch by talking about how these events impacted my family. And of course, the impact of the 7 Years' War was this exotic land called Kentucky becomes open for exploration. And in my direct family line, every Randall in my direct line from 1800 until 1958, until I was born. I was the last of the Kentucky Randalls in my direct line. And my two children, I guess, are the first two of the California Randalls. So the 7 Years' War again changed the trajectory of my family's life. and me. And so my family has essentially resided in Kentucky for a little over 200 years. And if it hadn't been for the 7 Years' War, that area would not have been controlled by the British. And of course, later the United States, because Kentucky ends up being carved out of Virginia as the 15th state. So King George says, we obviously cannot charge the colonists a tax rate that we're charging people in Britain. They don't have the same rights and responsibilities. But King George III proposes let's imposing a tax rate of approximately 5% of what we're charging people in Britain, just to help defray the cost of protection, because King George and the British cabinet are thinking we're going to have to double and maybe even more than double our troop presence in the New World, and that is going to take an awful lot of money. So the British attempt to alter the relationship with the colonists, which I would claim prompts an action-reaction cycle that eventually, notice that the first of these British actions, the Stamp Act, occurs in 1765. We do not get the Declaration of Independence for over a decade in 1776. So it isn't like the British changed the rules and the war is on. It's an action by the British, a reaction by the colonists. Another action by the British, another reaction by the colonists, and vice versa. Now, this is not a course in American history, although I've given you a little American history. But I want to point to three events that I think really typify this action-reaction cycle. Under A, the Stamp Act, put some stars there. That is very likely to be a question on the first exam. The Stamp Act was the first proposed direct tax on the colonies. Some of you may remember from your U.S. history class the Sugar Act, which was actually passed the year before the Stamp Act. And I have actually been asked in question, well, Mr. Randall, the Sugar Act was a tax, and why didn't this create a problem? And the answer to that is that politics is about perception. And the colonists perceived the Sugar Act not as a tax, but as a navigation duty, basically a cost of doing business. There had been navigation duties on other items, and this really did not stir the ire of the colonists. Obviously, there were some people who weren't happy with it, but it didn't create a strong reaction. The Stamp Act did. Here, the British want the colonists to buy these specially embossed stamps to put on things like newspapers and correspondence and real estate transactions and playing cards and virtually all written correspondence. The reaction included the formation of the Sons of Liberty. You may remember Patrick Henry, the famous give me liberty or give me death guy. My favorite saying of Patrick Henry's was when he boycotted the Constitutional Convention and they asked why didn't you go to the convention, and he said, because I smelt a rat. And smelling a rat is still, even today, a sign of being somewhat suspicious. The governor of Massachusetts gets his house burned down. The colonists burn these stamps. And we get introduced. I started to write a book many, many years ago called Alcohol and Politics, because it's amazing the connection between the two. For example, George Washington, during the colonial period, at one time was the largest producer of liquor in the colonies. In fact, he got his political start running for a colonial legislature called the House of Burgesses. And George invited I believe it was 342. I forgot the exact number, 320. It was 300 and something voters. And he plied them with something like 570 quarts of liquor. It's actually 391 voters. I just remembered that. Plied them with 570 quarts of liquor, and he was elected overwhelmingly, as you might imagine. George, by the way, also during the 7 Years' War, he was a British commander. And from the British perspective, George Washington's career was so undistinguished. Essentially, George, during the 7 Years' War, led troops off the battlefield in retreat after the senior commander had been killed in battle. And so George wanted to continue service in the British military, and the British refused that. So, once again, think about how different history might have been if George Washington had been serving on the British side instead of fighting against the British. So the Stamp Act was the action by the British, and the reaction: Sons of Liberty, Governor of Massachusetts gets his house burned down, etc. So we get introduced to another one of my alcohol and politics characters, Champagne Charlie. Charlie Townshend. You can see in your notes the Townshend Act, 1767. Champagne Charlie says the problem with the Stamp Act was that it requires the colonists to do things they don't normally do, which is buy these specially embossed stamps. Champagne Charlie, and he died in 1767 at age 42 of alcohol-related disease. You see, Champagne Charlie got his nickname because the way that he would practice for making speeches in the House of Commons was typically to drink a bottle of his favorite imported French champagne. And so that's how he got his name. So Champagne Charlie said, instead of buying these specially embossed stamps, let's put a general import tax on the items these colonists buy every day. Things like glass and lead and paper and paint and tea. And when the colonists buy our items, these taxes will be automatically added. In essence, the colonists will be screwed. Well, think about this. Think if you were a colonist and you're upset with the British changing the rules, and now, in essence, the British say every time you buy one of our items, you're screwed. Think about what your reaction might be. Well, one thing you might do is you might start competing against the British. So instead of importing glass, maybe you start seeing some people in the colonies making glass there in the colonies, or paper, or paint. Now, some items you can't do this, so another strategy would be what we call product substitution. Instead of buying as much tea, maybe you start drinking a little bit more of this exotic Spanish commodity called coffee. So think about that. I don't think that this political activity is the main or even a significant reason for why we're a nation of coffee drinkers, but certainly some sources that I've consulted said that this certainly gave kind of a kickstart for some people to give up their tea and political protest and give coffee a try. So maybe instead of going to Starbucks, maybe some of us would go to, I don't know, Star Tea. And I think you can get tea at Starbucks. I'm not much of a Starbucks drinker. I have a couple cups maybe a year. So now we have the creation of a new domestic industry. We actually now have some people making glass and lead and paper and paint in far higher numbers than before the Townshend Acts. British manufacturers begin screaming like wounded animals, saying we've lost so much business because of these taxes. Get rid of the tax. We were making more money without them in profits on our items. So the British manufacturers asked King George and the British government to get rid of the Townshend Acts, go back to business as usual, and we'll make a profit on the items they buy every day. King George says that's fine. We'll get rid of the taxes, but we'll keep it on one item. And of course, that item is tea. And in our next mini lecture, we will talk about the little tea party that occurred and why this is a major significant event in history.